Welcome back to the Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into something every lead auditor wrestles with out in the field, navigating the often tricky waters of clause ambiguity. We'll be looking specifically at how you can integrate Annex A.1 and A.2 guidance to resolve that ambiguity, drastically improve the accuracy of your interpretation, and ultimately write incredibly robust, system-focused audit reports. Let's get into it. So let's kick things off with a crucial question, one that really separates your basic checklist auditors from true system evaluators. Are you auditing merely for compliance, or are you actually looking for true environmental effectiveness? It's super easy to just look at a standard, read the text literally, and start checking off boxes, right? But ISO 14001:2026 is designed to be a dynamic framework. If you're only looking for procedural compliance, you are probably going to completely miss whether the organization is actually achieving its intended environmental outcomes. To audit for effectiveness, you absolutely have to understand the true intent behind the clauses. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with resolving ISO clause ambiguity, then move to understanding intent with Annex A.1, decoding structure with Annex A.2, elevating audit finding quality, and wrap up with writing system-focused reports. All right, part 1, resolving ISO clause ambiguity. You know, the standard's high-level structure is fantastic for aligning different ISO standards, but it definitely creates an inherent challenge for us. It basically forces us to choose between literal, mechanical compliance checking on one side and mature, systemic interpretation on the other. Clauses constantly use subjective terms like appropriate, proportionate, or taking into account. If you read those completely literally without any context, ambiguity just explodes. A literal interpretation leads to a super fragmented audit. You might ding an organization for a missing document, even if their environmental controls are actually fantastic in practice. A systemic interpretation, on the other hand, evaluates how processes collectively contribute to actual environmental performance outcomes. And this is exactly where our solution comes into play. You'll often hear people say that Annex A just provides non-mandatory guidance. And, well, that's technically true. It doesn't introduce any net new auditable rules. However, for a lead auditor, it acts as a critical analytical tool. Think of it as your ultimate decoder ring. It bridges the gap between the abstract requirements of the clauses and the practical implementation logic you actually need on the ground, which completely resolves those frustrating interpretive disputes. Moving right along to Section 2, Annex A.1, and understanding intent. So what exactly is Annex A.1? Basically, it's our conceptual framework. It explains the why behind the clauses so you can accurately judge an organization's intent and proportionality. It clarifies the conceptual boundaries of the environmental management system, or EMS. Without this context, you could easily interpret requirements way too rigidly or way too loosely. A.1 tells us loud and clear that the EMS isn't a static compliance mechanism. It's a dynamic, breathing framework for environmental protection, pollution prevention, and continual improvement. And sitting right next to it is our second tool, Annex A.2. This acts as our structural and terminology guide. If A.1 gives us the conceptual why, A.2 helps us navigate the how of the standard's specific language and structure. It ensures that when we read the terminology established by the high-level structure, we are all interpreting it with the same consistent, harmonized meaning, rather than just relying on our own subjective definitions. Before we get too deep into the terminology weeds of AA2, I want to highlight a massive practical benefit of applying that AA1 conceptual framework. It literally stops you from over-auditing. We've all seen it, right? An auditor expecting a tiny 4-person consulting firm to have the exact same massive environmental aspect evaluation as a heavy chemical plant. It just doesn't make sense. AA1 grounds you. It reminds you to focus on what the organization can realistically control, which saves absolutely everyone a lot of unnecessary administrative headaches. Okay, let's look closer at the second half of this in Section 3, Annex A.2 and decoding structure. It's honestly fascinating how easily structural terminology gets mixed up out in the field. Decoding these terms is what prevents those totally pointless compliance battles. Let's take the word shall. Yes, obviously it's a mandatory requirement, but A.2 clarifies that you need to assess if the requirement is fulfilled in practice, not just hunt for a written procedure. Then there's should, which gets confused with shall all the time. A.2 explicitly notes should is a recommended practice, not a mandate. Misinterpreting this leads auditors to force organizations to create useless procedures. And what about documented information? Well, A.2 tells us this is highly flexible. It doesn't mean forcing a company to print out a giant, dusty 50-page binder. It can be digital records, automated databases, or even real-time dashboards. Now let's apply this. Section 4, Elevating Audit Finding Quality. When you are out there in the field evaluating an observation, following these 4 steps using the annexes ensures your classification is completely unassailable and defensible. Step 1, you identify the specific clause requirement. Step 2, before you jump to any conclusions, you check Annex A.1 to understand the conceptual intent behind that clause. Step 3, you verify any structural wording through Annex A.2, and only then, in Step 4, do you classify the finding. This logic chain practically guarantees that you evaluate evidence based on intended outcomes rather than just a superficial literal reading. Applying this annex-informed logic is a real game changer. It helps you easily and accurately separate a harmless, minor documentation gap from a major systemic failure that's actually threatening environmental outcomes. For instance, if a procedure isn't perfectly formatted, but the environmental controls on the factory floor are working flawlessly, that is vastly different from a situation where the documentation looks incredibly pretty, but the employees have literally no idea how to handle a chemical spill. The Annex guidance forces you to look at the systemic impact. Finally, let's bring it all together in Section 5, Writing System-Focused Reports. Your working papers are your evidence trail. They're what prove your findings come from structured reasoning and not just a subjective gut feeling. To make them truly robust, you have to explicitly document your interpretive reasoning. You list the clause, sure, but you also must include an explanation of the Annex A interpretive considerations you used. Describe the objective evidence, evaluate the conformity, and provide a clear justification that connects the finding to systemic flaws. Hey, if you use Annex A to accept a digital dashboard as documented information, write that down. It makes your conclusion bulletproof against any challenges during certification reviews. Remember, a truly systemic report is all about connecting the dots across that plan, do, check, act cycle. And the Annex A structure practically maps this out for you. Say you find an issue with employee competence under Clause 7. That isn't just a localized training gap. Think about it. If an operator isn't competent in handling hazardous waste, the operational controls under Clause 8 are fundamentally compromised. In your report, you don't just write training record missing. You connect the dots. You explain exactly how that lack of competence is a direct systemic threat to operational control and actual environmental outcomes. That is what transforms a basic report into a high-value, strategic document for the organization. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to chew on. Armed with the Annex A decoder ring, the ability to resolve clause ambiguity, and a solid framework for system-focused reporting, is your next audit report really ready to drive true environmental improvement? Don't just settle for checking the boxes. Use the standard's full interpretive power to help organizations build resilient, sustainable systems. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.